Well, thank you very much, Xavier. It's truly a pleasure to be here. It's the first time I've come to EUI, but the setting is great, and it's just great to be here. Look forward to the presentation. I'm going to try to talk for maybe 40 minutes and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers. If you have any clarifying questions while I'm talking in the first 40 minutes, I'm happy to take them. As Xavier indicated, I want to look at trade-offs between efficiency, which we can think of as the net benefits from policies, or a close cousin would be cost effectiveness, and equity. And one measure of equity is how evenly the burdens are distributed across different groups. I'm going to focus on these trade-offs in the context of a revenue-neutral United States carbon tax. And by revenue neutral, what I mean is that whatever revenues come in from the tax are returned to the private sector through either lump sum or direct rebates to households, or alternatively through cuts in existing taxes like income taxes. And my motivation for this, there's really two motivations. One is efficiency is not the only issue when it comes to evaluating a policy. We care about fairness. And a policy that might be relatively low cost or highly efficient might still strike us as unattractive if all of the burden or too much of the burden is placed on one group relative to another. So I think that's important as an ethical matter. But there's another reason, which is I think to the extent that you can make policies more fair in terms of the distribution of the burden, you have a better chance of establishing them politically. In some ways, you have to win over certain groups in order to get political passage of a policy option. And so a lot of this is looking at how certain groups that might be disproportionately hurt under a simple carbon tax can be helped through particular ways of using the revenue or designing the tax. So creating a more even distribution of the burden is a way not only of getting greater fairness, but it might also be a way of enhancing political feasibility. For me, it's one thing to devise a policy that looks great in terms of efficiency, but if it has no chance of getting through politically, it seems a little bit less attractive. So we want to see how much does it cost, for example, how much might we have to sacrifice cost, increase cost, in order to create a fairer, more politically feasible policy. Now, I have two reservations in presenting this to this group. One is, as the title suggests, this is focusing on U.S. carbon tax. And I wonder, and perhaps in the Q&A we can see to what extent what I'm talking about will be relevant to what's happening in Italy, in Europe, or in other countries. And I have to say I have another reservation, and that is the upcoming U.S. election. I think depending on the outcome of the election, these kinds of considerations will get more or less saliency. So I'm in many ways hoping that these issues remain relevant in 2 days. We will see. So why might there be a trade-off? I'm suggesting that getting greater fairness might come at a cost in terms of efficiency. It might raise the overall cost of a policy. I want to give two reasons. One is that a way to make the distribution of outcomes more even or fair is to compensate particular groups. And one way to compensate is to take some of the revenue that could have been used in general to make the policy efficient and devote it to a particular group. But there's an opportunity cost there. So for example, if you want to help a particular household and make sure that low-income households aren't being unfairly affected, you might take some of the revenue and use it as direct lump sum payment to those households so that their burdens are less. But as a result of doing that, you have less revenue left over to generate efficiency by cutting pre-existing taxes across the board and avoiding the deadweight losses or the excess burden of those taxes. And to give you an idea of this, here are some measures of the so-called marginal excess burden of taxation under various existing U.S. taxes. The MEB, or marginal excess burden, indicates what is the cost to the economy of the last dollar raised by each of these taxes over and above the revenue. So, for example, the payroll tax, the estimate is that when the payroll tax is increased enough to generate $1 more of revenue, it actually costs the economy $1.45 because of the excess burden. Similarly, taxes on wage income, capital income, and corporate income have these excess burdens. Now, the estimates are not perfect, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the basic idea is because taxes have these excess burdens, the more you can take revenue from a carbon tax and use it to displace these distortionary taxes like the payroll tax, the personal income tax, the corporate tax, the bigger the gain. And yet, if you're now instead using some of the revenue to compensate particular parties, rather than to cut these other taxes, there's an opportunity cost. You're not getting as much of a gain as you would get by using the revenue to cut the distortionary taxes. So that's one reason for the trade-off, and we'll look at that more in just a moment. A second reason is that compensation itself can cause distortions. In general, the best way to keep the cost of the policy low is to use the revenue across the board to cut taxes everywhere. If instead you compensate by giving one group or another a special tax cut or subsidy, that distorts the relative taxation across different groups in the economy, and that can cause distortions as well. So for both of these reasons, the opportunity cost of compensation or the distortions caused by compensation, there's a trade-off in that making the impact more even can mean that the overall cost is higher. I'm going to look at this in two contexts. One is I'm going to look at it in the context of different industries and ask, in the absence of compensation, what industries would suffer the biggest losses of profit and thereby might vehemently oppose introducing the policy, so they would have a lot of political opposition. How can these losses of profit be reduced or avoided? And what's the trade-off here? How much does that add to the overall cost of the policy? And in doing so, there are two novel features of the model that I'm using that distinguish it from other computable general equilibrium models. One is that it accounts for the fact that capital, structures, and equipment in particular industries cannot immediately move to other industries. You cannot transform an agricultural tractor into a lathe that's used in the furniture industry. And as a result, when you introduce a policy, there's trapped capital or there's losses of profit in the industry that's being targeted. In contrast, if you assumed perfect capital mobility, the profit impacts are largely the same all across different parts of the economy, so you can't really register how particular industries might be hurt by a policy. Secondly, this model has a lot more detail on the tax system than the other general equilibrium models that have been used to look at climate policy, considering, for example, tax credits and tax deductions and other policies as well. The other half of this, in this seminar, is to look at households rather than industries. We want to say, in the absence of special compensation, how vulnerable are they? To what extent would a revenue-neutral carbon tax, in the absence of compensation, might it hurt low-income households more than higher-income households? And we kind of expect that to be the case because if you introduce a carbon tax, it's going to raise the prices of electricity and transportation especially, and these are goods and services that are disproportionately purchased as part of the budget of low-income households relative to higher-income households. So as a result, a simple carbon tax, revenue-neutral carbon tax, would create what we might call an unfair outcome. It would be regressive in the sense that it would disproportionately hurt the real, increase the cost of living of low-income households relative to higher-income households. How regressive might it be? And then the other half is to consider the trade-off. What does it cost to reduce regressivity or perhaps to at least to avoid entirely a welfare loss to the lowest income households? What's the sacrifice of overall efficiency that's necessary to create greater fairness? And here we distinguish three dimensions of the household impact. And in many ways, this is distinguished from what's been done in earlier literature. Much of the earlier literature looked exclusively at the expenditure side impact. In trying to figure out how the lowest income households are affected relative to higher income households, it said, how much does a carbon tax raise the prices to the various households, and how much would those higher prices affect the households of low income relative to higher income? But there's another side to the story, which is the income side impact. How much would a carbon tax affect the returns to labor and capital? And insofar as households differ in the relative dependence on labor and capital, that has distributional implications as well. And now some studies have begun to look at the income side impact, and what we're going to see is it can have an opposite effect from the expenditure side impact. But a third thing we do that I don't think any other study has done, that I haven't seen one, is to look at how these effects change over time. And what we find is that the sum of the expenditure side and income side impacts actually is very different in the short run from the long run and needs to be taken into account if you're concerned about fairness. So I'm going to very briefly talk about some features of the computable general equilibrium model. It distinguishes 35 industries, divides the U.S. production into those industries. It does have a simple formulation of foreign trade. The feature of the model we exploit here distinguishes 5 household groups that are different according to their income, from the lowest fifth to the highest fifth in terms of income. And there's one government sector that's meant to represent government at all levels. It has a fairly detailed treatment of energy production and use, but certainly not as detailed as some of the engineering models that look very closely at specific sectors. And it has a detailed treatment of the tax system. On the production side, producers make investments to maximize long-run profits or the present value of profits, dividends, net of share issues, taking into account adjustment costs. And as I already indicated, adjustment costs or imperfect mobility of capital is crucial for looking at profit impacts. The other CGE models that have looked at carbon taxes, it's perhaps no surprise that they haven't actually looked at different profit impacts across industries because they can't. They have perfectly mobile capital, and as a result, essentially the profit impacts end up being the same across industries. On the household side, the households make labor supply savings and consumption decisions to maximize utility over time. Forgive me for going very briefly through this, but in the short time I have, I want to try to get at some of the applications. There are some other models that have focused on carbon taxes, including revenue neutral ones, and I list them here, but I want to say that I'd say the closest model to mine is the IGM model, intertemporal general equilibrium model of Dale Jorgensen, Richard Goddell, Munho, and Pete Wilcoxon. One important difference between the two, however, is their model treats capital as perfectly mobile across sectors, so they're not able to look at profit impacts. The Adage and MIT EPA models have less detail on the tax system, as well as do not have imperfect capital mobility. I'm just going to spend a second on this slide to tell you that the production system for each of the 35 industries is based on a constant elasticity of substitution production function, where output is a function of capital K, labor L, energy and materials composites, which are themselves made up of various specific goods, but there's also adjustment cost given by this parameter phi, which is a function of the rate of investment. And again, at all levels in this production function, we have constant elasticity of substitution functional form. For consumer behavior, it's also constant elasticity of substitution. It's nested. One level, utility at time t is based on the infinite horizon discounted consumption in each period s. But C sub S is actually an aggregate of goods consumption and leisure consumption in each time period S. And then C goods consumption, C tilde, is a Cobb-Douglas aggregate of consumption of specific goods. The equilibrium requirements are that all the markets must clear, and so we solve for prices of labor, the interest rate, prices of goods, and either tax rate or debt issue in order to bring labor supply and demand into balance, savings and investment into balance, supply and demand for goods into balance, and say that new borrowing is given, then we have to make sure that revenue is enough to provide for whatever government spending exceeds new borrowing. I should say that all these prices have to be solved in effect simultaneously because what happens in the future is anticipated by firms and by households in the present. So future prices affect current decisions and current prices. So all the prices are in effect interdependent. This is to give you an idea. This is somewhat aggregated. I think there's only 24 industries shown here, but actually the model has 35 industries. And I'll briefly mention that there's a considerable more detail in terms of energy sectors. That's where we have a finer division or categorization. Again, I'm going through this quickly in order to get to the applications. I'm working on a book right now with my collaborator, Mark Halfstead. He is a fellow at Resources for the Future, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on environmental and energy policy. We will be publishing this work in a book by Columbia University, published by Columbia University Press. It's forthcoming, but it's not out yet. And once again, I do hope that these results are of some relevance to decision makers in the months to come. So here's just to give you an idea of what the carbon tax is that we're looking at. The solid line is the one I'm going to focus on in the left-hand diagram. That's the time profile of the carbon tax that I will consider in this talk. We also consider others. So you see it starts in 2015 and it rises, it ramps up to a certain value, and then it rises at about 4% a year up until it reaches $60 and then it's held flat. The carbon dioxide emissions that result from that, the left-hand side of this diagram, by the way, is a policy choice. The right-hand side is endogenous. It depends on the behavior of all the actors in the model. It shows in the reference or baseline case what the path of carbon dioxide emissions is. And then it shows you, the dashed line shows you what happens when under the carbon tax. The carbon tax here, by the end, by 2050, achieves about a 40% reduction in emissions. I'll skip this slide. So, again, my apologies, that was awfully quick, but it'll leave us some time to think about these trade-offs. And I want to start by looking at the trade-offs related to industry. As is the case in the US, and it's very much the case elsewhere, a few highly mobilized special interests can easily block a proposed policy. In the US, we see considerable evidence that certain industries, especially those that are either intensive suppliers of fossil fuels or intensive users of fossil fuels, they have a strong motivation to resist anything that's going to substantially hurt their profits. So if you believe that there's a reason, for the sake of political feasibility, to design a policy that will reduce the profit impacts on these stakeholders, the question then is, how much would that raise the costs? Is there a trade-off? If so, how big? So that's what we're going to look at here. So in order to see where to start, we say, well, what happens if we don't have any form of compensation? How do these different industries get affected? Now, what I'm going to show you, what you would probably want is much, much more time to see how these results change depending on different assumptions for parameters, different assumptions for the policy itself. But I think there's a general idea here that will hold up under that does hold up under sensitivity analysis. And that is, in the absence of compensation, there's a certain welfare cost and effects on various industries. And to begin with, the welfare cost here is measured as the equivalent variation. This is the cost to consumers as a whole. That's the money equivalent to their loss of well-being. So in some cases, we have got a zero-cost carbon tax, particularly if the carbon tax is very low for reasons that I won't get into now. But what I'm going to focus on is the carbon tax profile here that leads to some cost, and the cost depends on what you do with the revenues. If you return the revenues as a lump sum rebate, then per ton of CO2 reduced, and that's what I want to focus on here, it's $44 or so, which is less than the carbon tax, ultimate carbon tax, but it's a little bit more than the carbon tax rate at the beginning. That's the most expensive case. Why? Because you're not using the revenue to cut these existing distortionary taxes. You're wasting an opportunity, as it were. Now, on the other hand, if you used all the revenue this way to give lump sum rebates, it might be the best in terms of low-income households would do very well if they each got the rebate. So there can be a trade-off. But in terms of overall impact, in terms of efficiency, this is the worst. Next, if you use the revenue to cut payroll taxes, it's a little bit less costly because you're avoiding this distortionary tax to some degree. You get the cost even lower if you cut individual income taxes, and this fits with before. The marginal excess burden of individual income taxes tends to be a little bit bigger than the marginal excess burden of payroll taxes. Hence, if you use the revenue to cut income taxes, which include taxes on individual capital income, you get more of a gain, more of a reduction in cost. And in our model, the corporate income tax is the most distortionary. So if you use the revenue to cut that tax, you cut the cost the most relative to lump sum. Now, we haven't said anything here about fairness. Yes?
Is that also an effect on emission?
Slight. I don't have the slide here. It does have some effect, but very slight. The intuition is this: the carbon tax rate is what determines, first order, the incentive of firms to cut back. The carbon tax profile is the same in all four cases. But there are slight income effects that work through the effects on other industries that could affect emissions, but it's very small. That's a very good question, but I'll send you a table that shows it's small. So now let's talk about fairness. Well, in this slide, there's a lot of numbers here, and let's not try to go through them all. First, I'm again referring to the case with no compensation, and I'm considering two of the four cases that are considered here, namely the cuts in the individual income tax and the case of using the revenue to cut corporate income taxes. Those two cases I'm focusing on here. I guess the first thing to see, and this actually connects a little bit with what your question asked, these are profit impacts. You'll notice that for the energy or fossil-intensive sectors, the impacts are fairly similar here, whether you use the revenue to cut corporate taxes or to cut individual taxes. They're not all that difference between columns 1 and 2. That's an indirect way of saying the emissions impacts aren't that different. But you notice that there could be a real problem of political feasibility in this case. That these industries, by the way, what are these percentage losses? This is the percentage change in the present value of, in the present value of profits between the baseline case and the case with the carbon tax. We look at the present value of profits under business as usual, present value of profits under the carbon tax, and take the percentage difference. So it's an average over time in the profit impacts. So there's very big effects on the top 10 industries listed here, although non-fossil electricity generation, which you can think of as largely renewables and some hydro, it actually benefits from a carbon tax because there's a substitution toward that. But here are the costs per ton at the bottom. I showed that on the previous slide, around $30 and around $17. Now, yes?
What's your time period calculated? So is this in the, because, just thinking of the cheap gas period in the last several years, there really hasn't been any profits for coal mining or coal fired. So the baseline, if that was your baseline, then it would be zero?
We set up the baseline data taking an average over the last years from 2007 to 2012.
Okay. So
okay, now,
cheap gas.
but some of the sensitivity analysis, we try other baselines, but it's meant to be kind of an average.
But that might actually make it a lot easier. The fact that the status quo right now,
That's right.
without any carbon tax,
That's right.
you're not making any money in coal or...
That's fair. Okay. So now let's think about how you might compensate some of the most vulnerable industries. I guess the first question is it fair to even try to prevent profit losses or reduce them in some industries? Some folks would say, no, I mean, these guys are causing the problem. They're producing these fossil fuels. That's a debatable issue. My view is that we consumers are as much responsible as the producers. And moreover, if this is what's necessary to bring through a policy to survive the to overcome political resistance and help our children and grandchildren in a big way, I think pragmatism suggests that it is worth doing. So I'm going to assume that it's worth contemplating, and let's figure out what's the cost of either eliminating or reducing profits in the most vulnerable industries. So we measured most vulnerable according to the size, the percentage change in the present value of profits. And the top 10 industries with the largest percentage changes, not necessarily absolute changes, were our top 10. And they're the ones that are targeted. And I want to focus now on how you could do that. Well, one way that I'm going to just mention briefly, for lack of time I can't get into, but I actually think it's important, is you could have a carbon tax where a certain portion of your emissions, inframarginally, is exempt. This turns out to have formally be exactly the same as a cap and trade system with some allowances given out free. And that can generate rents. And what we find is that by giving a certain amount of exemption, and that's what this column 3 shows, we can eliminate the profit losses virtually in all industries, slight loss still in the oil extraction industry, but it comes at a cost. And why does it come at a cost? Because the more you give an exemption, the less revenue you have to cut existing taxes. So that's the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost is suggested here, which shows that the cost per ton is about $35 as opposed to anywhere from $17 to $30 in the absence of, I should say the relevant comparison would be with column 1 because the rest of the revenue are being used here to cut individual income taxes. So it does increase the cost, I don't know, maybe about 15% or something like that. A second approach would be to offer corporate income tax credits to these 10 most vulnerable industries. Now, we can debate whether that's a good idea, whether it's fair, et cetera, but the idea is this will help reduce the burden, and the numbers in the right-hand, in column 4, in parentheses, are the magnitude of the credit in billions of dollars. And we can actually eliminate the profit loss entirely with that amount of expenditure. And the overall increase is, again, similar to the case of tradable tax exemptions. It increases the cost from about $29 or $30 to $35. So you can ask yourself, is this a price worth paying? The economy as a whole, consumers as a whole are paying more. But now we've redistributed the burden. Column 5, instead of looking at a tax credit, where a tax credit is a fixed amount, in column 5, it's a corporate income tax rate cut that's targeted to certain industries. And in this case, we have to, I'm not saying this is plausible, I mean, this is politically feasible, we'd actually have to eliminate corporate income taxes in some cases, and even then, some industries would continue to have profit losses. The tax credit gives you a lot more benefit It's better targeted. But we at least looked at this case as well. And even in this case of column 5, where some industries continue to have profit losses, as you can see, that raises there is an interesting result here. We were expecting this to be cost increasing, but in fact it reduced costs. And when we looked at this, what we found is the reason is that the original tax system, in terms of the deadweight loss per dollar of revenue of the corporate tax, differs a lot depending on which industry faces the tax. And I have to confess, we're going to have to look at this more closely, but it looks as if what's happening here is that by reducing the corporate tax in certain industries, even though we're making the tax rate less even across the board, we're actually benefiting the economy because the deadweight loss per dollar of revenue is becoming more even. So at least that's the hypothesis. Like I said, this hasn't been fully worked out, but we got this surprising result that rather than further distort the economy, it actually creates a better allocation across industries of the corporate income tax. But I want to put that tentatively now, because I don't think we've looked at it far enough. Well, this is all to suggest that perhaps even in the, quote, the worst cases, the increase in cost relative to the case with no compensation, is maybe 15% or 20%. So what this suggests is that we can eliminate profit losses in 9 of the 10 most vulnerable industries through targeted corporate income tax credits, and it raises the cost, at least in this central case, by about 20%. You can decide whether that's a price worth paying. In the case of targeted corporate income tax rate cuts, you can virtually eliminate the profit losses in 7 of the 10 most vulnerable industries, and I'm putting it tentatively out there, it deserves a closer look. It doesn't raise costs. It appears that it actually improves the allocation of the corporate income tax across industries, but that needs further look. So the next question is, and this is beyond the model, how much do we gain in terms of political feasibility? Political feasibility depends upon a lot of things that are outside of this model. Is it worth it? And a second question is, the first question is, how much does it enhance feasibility? That's the benefit. Is that benefit worth the cost? Now, I promised to talk only for about a half an hour, or did I say 40 minutes? I said 40 minutes. So I'm doing a little better on time than I had worried I was. So, okay, good. So I'm about the 25-minute point, I think. So I know I've gone through a lot of things quickly. Hopefully during the Q&A we can get into more details. But let me turn to the other trade-off. You might worry that a carbon tax is going to be unfair in the sense that it'll disproportionately hurt the economic status of low-income households. And that's what we want to look at here and ask, what's the cost of reducing the unevenness of impact, reducing regressivity, or in another case we say, what's the cost of absolutely preventing any welfare loss to the lowest income household? Slightly different question. Those are the two questions. Well, there are 3 dimensions of impact that can be divided here. One is the expenditure side. Carbon tax, like just about any energy tax, is going to raise the price of goods, especially of energy-intensive goods and services like electricity, home heating, transportation. In the US, and I suppose it's true in Italy and in Europe as well, if you look at budget shares, low-income households spend a larger fraction of their budget on transportation, on electricity, on home heating. Certainly true in the US. And it's very easy to show that if you raise the prices of those goods, the impact on the cost of living will be especially high for the low-income households. It will be regressive. So that's the expenditure side impact. And there's also another impact, though, which is that a carbon tax will affect returns to labor and capital. Holding goods prices constant, let's put that aside, what's the effect on the returns, the nominal returns to labor and capital? And to the extent that households differ, that low-income and high-income households differ in their dependence on labor and capital, that's going to have different effects. Say, for example, a carbon tax disproportionately lowers capital returns relative to labor returns. That suggests that a carbon tax could have a progressive impact because it'll disproportionately affect the rich who are more dependent on capital. So that's the income or source side impact. And I've already suggested they can work in the opposite direction. So what's the overall effect? And then we'll look at the effects over time. Now, other studies had focused, there are a number of studies that look at the expenditure side impact. Here's a well-done study by Gib Metcalf, who's at Tufts University, worked on in the Obama administration for some years. And I simply want to say that this is to show that if you just look at the expenditure side impact, the lowest quintile, or the lowest decile here, is going to have the biggest percentage loss of income from a $15 per ton carbon tax compared to higher income households, much higher, 3 times as high as the highest income household. And this kind of result is very standard. There's very few, I haven't seen a study that has disagreed with the idea that on the expenditure side, it's regressive. There's also some other studies I list here by Ian McKibben and his co-authors, and Adele Morris and Jordan Matur. A number of studies have looked at that. But we want to go further by looking at the income or source side impact. I didn't list them here, but there's one study from MIT that has started to look at that. We look at that as well. I think a distinguishing feature of our work is that we're also looking at the changes over time. So, just to give you an idea why the income side impact could differ across households, this isn't showing income, but it's showing wealth. There's correlations here. And it shows here that the fraction of income that's labor income is much higher for low-income households than for higher income households who have a much larger fraction that comes from capital. There's also the issue of how much government transfers play a role, but we purposely have kept transfers constant in all of our simulations. But what this suggests is that any policy that hurts capital relative to labor, based on these data, it's going to especially hurt higher income households because they're more dependent relatively on capital income than labor income. So in the absence of targeted compensation, which we're going to focus on here first, consider what happens if you return all the revenues from the carbon tax lump sum, or if you return the revenues through across-the-board personal income tax rate cuts, where the rate cuts are proportionally the same for all levels of income. So I'm going to look at expenditure side, income side, and overall impacts. And there's a lot of information here. I'm going to try to summarize and yet not spend too much time, so we have time for questions. On the upper left, we have the expenditure side impacts where recycling is in the form of lump sum rebates. That's where it's an equal amount to every quintile, household quintile. On the bottom right, we have personal income tax recycling, where every household gets the same proportional rate reduction in the personal income tax. Looking at the top left, we're looking at the 5 quintiles from the first group, Q1, to the 5th group, Q5, Q5 being the richest, Q1 being the lowest 20% of households. And we have this welfare impact looked at over 5 time spans. Each time span starts with 2015. But in the first case, it's just 5 years from 2015 to 20. In the second, in red, it's going from 15 years from 2015 to 2030. In green, it's looking over 25 years, etc. And in the light blue, it's actually the infinite horizon. Now, these are infinite horizon households. I know it's a stretch to think that a household's going to stay in its same group over infinite time, but we're kind of forced to do it that way, but if you want, you can look at the shorter time frame if you think it's more meaningful, okay? We don't
start from the same year.
All starts from 2015. So it's the length of time, and in each case we're looking at a welfare measure, the equivalent variation, the money metric of the change in utility over that relevant interval. In what, 5 years, 15, 25, 35, infinite. Well, what you see from this first case is that under lump sum recycling, no big surprise, the expenditure side impact is regressive, because if you look at, let's say, the dark blue bar, it's a bigger impact proportionally. I should have mentioned the vertical axis in all cases is the money equivalent utility change relative to initial wealth, or wealth over that period, over that 5, 15, 25, or 35-year period. So there's a bigger proportionate change of in cost to the lowest income household compared to the highest. That's true no matter how many years you look out. The second thing to notice is that in all cases it's regressive, but the absolute magnitudes of the effect increase depending on how far you look out. And that is consistent with the fact that we have a rising carbon tax. The effects on prices are growing over time. So depending on how long you look into the future, the impacts, even though you're averaging them through time, get bigger. Okay, no big surprise, regressive. Let's take the case of personal income tax recycling. Here the effects are also regressive in general. There's something that I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't quite figured, which is why it's close to proportional if you go through the first 5 years. Without getting into the details, I think part of this is that welfare depends on leisure, and when you cut the personal income tax, you're effectively raising the price of leisure, and if rich people have more of a relative expense on leisure than poor people, that could have an effect that neutralizes some of the regressivity, but that still needs to be looked at. So in general, there isn't a big difference. The bottom line point is there's not a big difference between the expenditure side and the lump sum recycling and personal tax recycling cases. Where there is a big difference is on the income side. On the income side, first of all, notice that the sign of the effect is different. In general, this policy, although it hurts households because prices of goods and services have gone up, if you hold prices of goods and services constant, the returns to factors actually have increased. Not in real terms, because the reason they don't go up in real terms is because the goods prices have gone up. But if you ignore that effect, the expenditure side effect, there's actually a positive income side effect. And in this case, it looks kind of regressive in the lump sum case. The effects get bigger over time, not too surprising. And it's kind of regressive progressive in the lump sum case, because the beneficial effect is a bit larger for the low-income households, which suggests that now you might have sort of a balancing out of the income side and expenditure side effects. In contrast, if you use the revenue to cut personal income taxes, the income side effects display a different pattern. And the fact is that the cut in the personal income tax is especially helpful to the higher income households that rely more on capital income. So you don't have that complete offset. And that's reflected then in the final graphs here, which is to show that there is a real difference between the two in terms of the overall impacts. I'm sorry, here we go. In the case of the lump sum recycling, the impacts tend to balance out. In the case of personal income tax recycling, they don't balance out because the income side effect doesn't help you. And in this case, we get an overall regressive impact. So I've gone through this quickly, but the summary is the expenditure side impacts are adverse, as we know. Most regressive when recycling is lump sum, and the impacts and regressivities expand over time. On the income side, the effects are beneficial, but they differ depending on the nature of recycling, and that's what counts for the overall effects differing. The progressive under lump sum recycling, and either regressive or proportional under personal tax recycling, so that when you combine the two effects, the expenditure side and income side effects tend to balance out under lump sum, whereas they do not under personal tax recycling. So, what we're emphasizing here in contrast with earlier literature is that the effects really depend on the time frame. And under lump sum recycling, the income side effects dominate in the short run, but over the longer term, the expenditure side impacts dominate. And the results are ultimately, that is in the long run, close to proportional, where it's not at all proportional under personal income tax recycling, for reasons I've given. So if you're asking the question, is a carbon tax going to be fair or not, or is it going to be regressive or not, this is before we even talk about compensation, you need to look at both the income side and the expenditure side, and a lot's going to depend on whether you're looking short-term or long-term. So the reason to do this is, in part, to say, well, suppose we, for example, are concerned about using the revenue to cut personal income taxes, we're worried that it's regressive. How much would it cost to either eliminate the regressivity or eliminate the effect on lowest income household? We have not yet fully worked this out. I can only give you kind of a rough estimate. What we find here is that, I've showed you these results already, that if there's no compensation, lump sum recycling costs the economy about $45 in our central case. Personal income tax recycling costs less because you can use the revenue to cut personal income tax, the distortional tax. If instead of using all the revenue to cut the personal income tax, you target some of the revenue toward a lump sum rebate to the lowest income household, the cost goes up, and I'm using the approximate symbol because we're still working on this and we haven't got it fully worked out, and we need a lot to look more. But it raises the cost a bit. And you can ask, is that worth it in order to help the low-income household a lot? I would like to be able to present you more detailed results from this, but I don't have them. But I hope that at least the methodology here and the issues being raised will be of some interest, and perhaps your comments will help us in terms of the work that we continue on this. So I think I may have thrown a lot, perhaps too much at you in these 40 minutes, but let me offer at least what I would say are three basic conclusions that come from this that I feel pretty confident about, even though there's more work to be done. That we find that with judicious revenue recycling to firms, in the 7 most vulnerable U.S. industries, you can avoid their profit losses at an added cost of less than 20%. Some might say, well, that's still a lot. Others might say not. And we find in some cases the added cost is zero. At least initially, we're finding that if you do it through targeted corporate income tax rate cuts, it virtually has no cost. And it's something we need to look at more closely, but our belief at this point is that it's because in the initial tax system, the relative taxation of capital across industries is inefficient, and by giving particular relief to some industries, you can actually improve the relative corporate taxation. Looking at household groups, a lot depends on the method of recycling. It's either regressive or close to proportional. So before you say whether a carbon tax is unfair to the lowest income households, at least in terms of regressivity, you really have to think about the method of revenue recycling. And we see that there are big differences over time as well. So let me stop there, and we'll open it up to Q&A.